Put a man in the mountains at 20 below and tell him he has until dark to build the shelter he will sleep in that night. Most people would start cutting logs, four walls, a roof, a big fire in the middle, and get inside before the temperature drops. That sounds sensible. It can also leave you shivering before morning. An old mountain man might walk right past a good pile of timber without touching his axe. He would look at the snow around the trees. He would watch which branches were moving in the wind. He might kick through the snow with his boot and look at the ground underneath. Then he might walk another 50 yards and build there instead, because the first thing that could ruin a winter shelter had nothing to do with how thick the walls were. And if he got that first choice wrong, he could spend every night afterward cutting firewood just to make up for it. Picture two small cabins made from the same logs. Put one in an open flat where the wind has a straight run at the walls. Put the other behind thick spruce with a low ridge at its back. Light the same fire in both. The first man spends the evening feeling cold air push through every loose crack. His flames bend when the door opens. Smoke jumps around the hearth. By midnight, he has already burned through part of tomorrow's wood. The second cabin does not need to fight nearly as much wind because the trees and ground are doing part of the work. That was the first shelter mountain men used, and it did not require building anything. It was the land itself. Finding that spot took more thought than simply looking for the deepest hollow. Low ground could collect cold air after sunset. A creek bottom might give easy water, but leave a man sitting in one of the colder spots around. Dead trees overhead could drop limbs when a storm arrived. A steep slope loaded with snow could create another problem entirely. The signs were already there if a man knew what he was looking at. Snow packed against one side of tree trunks showed where the wind had been pushing it. Bent branches told the same story. A narrow opening between two ridges could funnel wind straight through the woods. Walk around the other side of the ridge, and the branches might hardly be moving. That difference meant fewer drafts, less wood burned, and fewer trips outside with an axe when the temperature was dropping. Once the spot was chosen, most people would finally start worrying about the walls. But there was another problem that could make a good roof and a hot fire almost useless. You would not see it blowing through a crack. It would not dump snow onto your bed. It could work on you for 8 hours without making much noise at all. The clue was underneath your boots. Scrape away the snow, and there was frozen earth. Lie down close to it, and your warm body was pressed against something much larger and colder than you were. A man could have a bright fire warming his face while the ground slowly pulled heat from his back. That is why the bed could matter almost as much as the walls. Before dark, a mountain man might cut armloads of spruce or pine boughs and carry them inside. Dry grass, leaves, robes, and whatever other dry material he had could go on top. Not a decorative layer 2 inches deep. Enough material that when his shoulders and hips crushed it down during the night, there was still something between him and the frozen dirt. 20 minutes spent carrying another armload before sunset could save hours of feeding a fire later. A thin bed meant his body had to keep replacing heat lost into the ground. A thick bed made the ground much less of a problem before the fire ever entered the picture. You can see how easily a man could get this backwards. He could spend an extra hour cutting logs to make a wall thicker while lying on 6 inches of crushed boughs all night. The wall looked like shelter, so it got the attention. The bed just looked like a pile of branches. But come 3 in the morning, the branches might be doing more for him than another log in the wall. Old Wood's knowledge was full of things like that. The parts that looked impressive were not always the parts doing the most work. Now the kind of shelter started to matter. A trapper passing through for one night did not need the same building as a man staying until spring. If darkness was 2 hours away, cutting logs for a full cabin could leave him with two nice walls and nowhere dry to sleep. A small lean-to or brush shelter that was finished before sunset was worth more that night than a cabin that would be excellent tomorrow. Poles could make the frame. Bark, brush, boughs, hides, or blankets could turn the weather. The back faced the wind, the opening faced the place where the fire would go. It might not look like much, but a man could be under it, on a deep bed, with flames in front of him before darkness settled into the timber. If he planned to stay for months, the math changed. Now every hour spent fitting a log or closing a crack could pay him back, night after night. A stronger roof mattered because it might carry snow through dozens of storms. A better door mattered because it might be opened hundreds of times. A real hearth mattered because there would be a fire inside for weeks. This was where a cabin became worth the labor, Even then, bigger was not always better. Every extra foot inside was another foot of cold space he had to warm with wood he cut himself. A tall roof and large room might look comfortable, but the fire did not care how nice the cabin looked. It simply had more cold air around it to warm. Think about the wood behind that heat. Every log in the fireplace had first been a tree or branch somewhere outside. Somebody had to find it, cut it, drag it through the snow, split it if needed, stack it, and carry it inside. A cabin twice as hard to heat did not just mean a larger fire. It meant more swings of the axe tomorrow, more trips through snow, wetter gloves, more sweat under heavy clothes, and less time for everything else that needed doing. A small cabin could save a man work every single day simply because he had less empty space to heat. Then came the cracks. Stand inside a rough log cabin with a fire burning and one pencil wide gap behind your shoulder. Your face can feel hot while one thin stream of winter air keeps touching the same spot on your back. After an hour, you stop noticing the beautiful fire and start noticing that crack. Now put 20 or 30 of those gaps around the walls. Throwing another log on the fire helps for a while, but it does nothing about why the room keeps losing heat. So mud, clay, moss, grass, and whatever else worked could be pushed between the logs. Every crack filled was one less little opening the fire had to fight for the rest of winter. The door could waste even more heat. It had to open, which meant a man could not simply seal it shut with mud. A rough door that left gaps around the edges could leak all night. Hides, blankets, wood, or other material could help close those spaces. Openings for light were kept small for much the same reason. Imagine cutting firewood for an hour, carrying it back through knee-deep snow, and then burning part of it just to warm cold air coming through a hole you could have covered. Mountain men did not have to understand a formula for heat loss to see the waste in that. By now, the cabin is getting tighter. The gaps are filled. The door closes better. The roof is covered. The fire is throwing good heat. It sounds like the job is nearly finished, but making the shelter tighter created another problem, and this one could become worse because the cabin was built well. Before getting to that, there was something sitting directly over the man's head that could turn several days of good shelter work into a pile of broken poles. A few inches of powder on a roof looks harmless. Let snow fall all night, then another day, then let the wind push it into a deeper drift on one side. Now those roof poles are carrying real weight. Wet snow makes it worse. A weak pole begins to bend. A joint shifts. Maybe a few crumbs of dirt or bark fall onto the bed. Those are warnings a man did not want to ignore. A roof that failed on a clear afternoon could be repaired. A roof that came down during a night storm could dump snow, broken timber, and cold air straight into the place where he was sleeping. Roof poles had to be stout enough for the job, and the roof needed enough slope to help weather move off instead of collecting every bit of it. Bark, split wood, brush, sod, or other material could cover the top depending on the kind of shelter and what was nearby. A temporary camp and a cabin built for the season would not look the same. Both had one job that mattered every night: keep the sleeping place dry. A man could deal with cold. Cold and wet together were a much harder bargain. One little roof leak shows why. At first, it is just a drip. It lands near the edge of the bed every few minutes. The fire is hot, so nobody worries much about it. An hour later, the corner of a robe is damp. A boot gets pushed against it. Snow from that boot melts too. By bedtime, the place where a man planned to put his feet is wet. Then the fire burns lower, and the temperature inside drops. That harmless drip from supper has followed him into the coldest part of the night. Moisture did not always come through the roof either. A man could carry it through the door on his own body. Snow stuck to boots and the bottoms of trousers. He came inside, stood beside the fire, and that snow became water. Gloves soaked while clearing the roof were hung to dry. A man chopping wood could sweat under heavy clothing even when the air was bitterly cold. If he worked until his shirt was damp and then sat still, that wet cloth started working against him. So snow was knocked off before it melted inside. Socks and gloves were dried when the fire was strong. Wet bedding was dealt with before bedtime, instead of being discovered after the fire had fallen. This is where a winter cabin starts looking less like a building and more like a full day's work. The roof needs watching, wood needs cutting, clothes need drying, snow needs clearing, gaps need plugging, bedding needs keeping dry. None of those jobs is hard to understand. The trouble is that winter keeps bringing them back. Ignore one for a few hours and you usually have more work later. Ignore several at once, and the cabin can begin slipping away from you, even though all four walls are still standing. Now go back to that tight cabin. The man has done everything right so far. He chose a protected spot. He built small. He filled the cracks. He made the door fit. He put a heavy roof over his head. He has a deep bed of dry boughs and a good fire burning. Then his eyes start watering. Smoke is hanging below the roof. He coughs and opens the door. The cold air rushing in clears some of it, but now the cabin is losing the heat he worked so hard to keep. The better he had become at stopping unwanted air, the more important it became to give smoke a proper way out. A fire needs air, and smoke needs somewhere to go. In an open shelter, that problem partly solves itself. In a tight cabin, it does not. A hearth, chimney, or smoke opening had to move the smoke outside while allowing the fire to keep burning. That sounds simple until snow starts collecting around the opening or the wind changes direction. Smoke that went cleanly up the chimney yesterday could begin rolling back into the room today. Soot built up. Sparks could land on dry wood. A blanket hung too close to the hearth could scorch. Closing the cabin had saved heat, but now the man had to control exactly where air entered and where smoke left. The fire itself brought the next problem. A roaring fire makes almost any decent shelter feel good for a while. It can also fool a man into thinking his camp is better than it really is. Feed enough wood into a poor cabin, and the flames can cover up drafts, thin bedding, wet clothes, and too much open space. The truth comes later, when the wood pile begins getting smaller. 6 armloads stacked beside the door can look like plenty at sunset. Supper cooks over the flames, wet gloves hang nearby, a large piece goes on before bed. Then midnight comes, and another piece is needed. Later, another. By 3 in the morning, that pile does not look nearly as large. If the wind has picked up and the cabin leaks, the wood disappears even faster. Now, every mistake made while building the shelter has turned into another log that needs to be burned. This was why gathering wood before a storm mattered so much. Dry standing wood could be cut while there was still light. Small dry pieces were kept for starting or rebuilding a fire. Larger pieces could hold heat longer. A man learned which wood in his country burned quickly and which left good coals. More important, he gathered it while gathering was still easy. Every armload stacked before the snow deepened was one less trip he would have to make later. Going outside for wood did not just cost time. It meant opening the door, losing heat, getting snow on clothing, and using strength that might be needed tomorrow. Now let the weather stay, not for one night, but for several days. The first morning is almost pleasant. Snow covers the timber and the fire is going. There is dry wood beside the wall. The roof is holding. A man clears a path, knocks. Snow from the roof, brings in another load, and gets on with his work. Nothing about the shelter feels like survival yet. It simply feels like a good place to be while the weather is bad. By the second day, the same jobs take longer. Snow reaches higher on the boots. The path to the woodpile has filled in again. Gloves come inside damp after clearing the roof. A little snow blows in every time the door opens. The wind has moved around and found a gap near one corner that was quiet yesterday. One roof pole has more snow over it than the others. The fire is still strong, so each problem looks small. A handful of moss fixes the draft. The gloves can dry. The roof can be cleared. Another log goes on the fire. The danger is not any one of those things. It is what happens when they begin stacking up. On the third day, the woodpile is lower. The man is more tired. His boots never seem completely dry. Clearing the roof takes longer because the snow is deeper around the cabin. Maybe he decides the little drip near the wall can wait until morning. Maybe he puts off cutting another load of wood because there seems to be enough left. Maybe he falls asleep before checking the fire as carefully as he normally would. These are not foolish choices. They are tired choices, and winter has always been good at making tired choices expensive. Sometime before daylight, he wakes because the cabin feels different. The bright fire he left has fallen to a few dull coals under gray ash. The wind outside is still moving through the trees. He can hear it before he gets out of the bed. This is the point where all the little decisions made before the storm finally show what they were worth. If the shelter was built badly, several problems arrive together. Cold air comes through the cracks. His shoulder presses through thin bedding toward frozen ground. Damp socks from yesterday feel cold. The big room that felt comfortable with a roaring fire has lost its warmth. The wood he meant to bring inside is still under a tarp or pile of snow outside. Before he can get warm again, he has to leave the bed, find fuel, rebuild the fire, fight the drafts, and warm everything that has gone cold. A good shelter does not stay warm forever. It does something more important. It gives him time. The wind is still mostly on the other side of the wall. The thick bed is still keeping his body off frozen earth. The robe around him is dry. The roof has kept snow away from the sleeping place. The room is small. Dry wood is within reach. Under the gray ash, there may still be enough live coal to catch a curl of bark and a handful of dry twigs. He can get the fire back without first having to fix the whole camp. And there is the part that is easy to miss when you look at an old mountain cabin. The cabin itself was never doing one big job. The ridge behind it was stopping some of the wind. The wall was stopping more. Mud and moss were closing the little gaps. The roof was keeping water off the bed. A foot of boughs was separating the man from frozen dirt. Robes were keeping heat close to his body. The chimney was moving smoke away. The woodpile was keeping him from walking into a storm every time the flames dropped. That was how mountain men built shelters for extreme winters. There was no one magic cabin design. A man passing through might use a rough, open shelter that barely looked like a building. A trapper spending the season might live behind thick log walls. What mattered was that each part took one problem away before that problem reached the man. Build in the open, and you spend the winter cutting extra wood to fight the wind. Leave gaps in the logs, and every cold draft becomes another stick on the fire. Sleep on a thin bed, and the frozen earth keeps taking heat no matter how good the roof is. Let snow melt into the blankets, and now the fire has to dry them before it can warm you. Gather too little fuel, and the worst weather is exactly when you have to leave shelter to find more. One mistake makes the next job harder. The old mountain men were not tougher because cold somehow hurt them less. Bark was not better than a modern roof, and a buffalo robe was not magic. Their advantage was knowing where the trouble would come from before it arrived. They looked at a windy clearing and saw tomorrow's woodpile disappearing. They looked at frozen ground and saw a coal back at 3 in the morning. They looked at a small crack between logs and saw a draft that would blow there for months. They looked at 6 armloads of wood and knew the pile would not look nearly as large after midnight. So the next time you see an old log cabin sitting in deep snow, do not just look at the walls and fireplace. Look at the timber behind it. Look at the slope of the roof. Look at how small the room is. Picture moss stuffed between the logs, wet socks hanging beside the hearth, a pile of boughs underneath the bed, and dry wood stacked where a man could reach it before daylight. Those little things were the shelter just as much as the logs were. When the fire finally burned down in the worst part of the night, the cabin did not need to defeat winter. It only needed to keep the cold from reaching the man faster than he could get those coals burning again. That was the real trick. Not one secret shelter, but a dozen small problems handled before they had a chance to become one big one. If you enjoy learning the old skills and common sense that kept men alive when there was no easy way out, hit subscribe. There's a lot more of this old mountain knowledge worth keeping around.